So for this last chunk, I want to step back from those examples and look a little more, in some sense generally, but also more directly at what's involved in applying a system perspective. And I just put in again this illustration of the system with its diagram descriptions and dynamics and its connection with reality, but also its connection with people, just as one reminder of how the system's perspective can get applied. But let's look at when and where you might want to explicitly use some kind of systems approach. First of all, when there are more than 4 chunks for your working memory. When you have anything that is more complicated than just 4 items, then you may very well want to look at it from a systems perspective. If you're designing a new project, then it's actually very helpful to do that design, as the architects here will know, by being able to play around with a variety of possibilities before you lock things down into too tight a design. When there's a perplexing issue, a habit that you've tried to change or some other thing that's just, you just feel stuck. Taking a systems approach is a great way to get yourself unstuck and see patterns and pictures that you haven't seen, that just didn't show up for you before. Anytime you need a shared understanding between people, then the discipline, if you will, of diagrams, descriptions, and dynamics is a great way of building a shared understanding. And I'll go into that a little bit more in just a moment. Resolving conflicts. When you're in a conflict, people focus on whatever it is that's the hot spot of the conflict. If you're just doing it in a, I say, you say, that sort of thing. If the conflict is not so bad that you can't work together, if you map out the system that you both feel is going on, one thing that will happen is you will discover common ground. You'll discover the parts of the system that you agree on, and then you can also identify the places where you disagree. But then you can address those disagreements in the context of what you share. And it's classic in conflict resolution to make the common ground conscious. Systems help with that. And simply for the fun of it, for the delight of what you will discover when you do good system exploration. Okay, so let's say that you have now decided that one of these things applies for you. You want to get in, you want to actually make some of this system stuff real for you. First thing that you need to do is to surface your thoughts. And what I've got here is a whole bunch of chunks, more than 4, that aren't connected to each other. They're just thoughts that are out there. Ask yourself, what are the key parts in your system? And remember, your system is what you're building. We'll have some reference to reality, but it isn't as though you have to decide what's happening in reality. You decide how much detail you need, what's the territory you're focusing on, all of those things. And what are the key relationships in your system? And you don't have to hit home runs here. You don't have to get everything right at the beginning. You just have to start. And do it with some tool that is really, or tools that are really flexible. And things like Post-its are great for this, because they force you to put your information into small chunks And then you can move the chunks around and you can organize them in fresh ways. And so you don't get locked into the way you happen to write it down. The value of this first step is that it externalizes out of your working memory all kinds of material. And the visual record holds for you much, much more than your working memory can hold. And it's shareable. You can do it in a group. And it doesn't require a story. And here I want to go off on the difference between stories and maps. So what is a story? I like to think of a story as a trail through the landscape of thought. It's a linear trail that moves through a vast arena of possibility. It picks out one particular trail through that. Whereas maps are multidimensional containers for often unlimited stories. They both have their value. Stories are best for describing the past, where we know in some sense what the trail was that was taken. And they're also good if you have one particular scenario that you want to play out, and you want to see how that trail would go. But maps are much better if you're involved in a creative design process, where you don't know the trail yet, and in some sense you don't want to lock down the trail yet. You want to keep open the possibility to look at a whole variety of different paths. Then you need maps, not stories, and exploring those possibilities. Many years ago, a theologian called Thomas Berry popularized the notion of the new story of the cosmos, as he was looking at the scientific story going back to the Big Bang, but he was looking at that sort of through a more philosophical lens. And so it was a new story, but it was a new story about the past, and that really fit. If you try to have a new story about the future right now and try to say, this is the new story for the future, you run the danger of locking things down. So for me, what we need these days is more a matter of new maps than it is new stories. New stories provide an invitation, new maps provide an invitation for exploration. So what's the downsides here? The downside of the story is that it puts you in a groove. You're in that story. The story's going to go wherever it's going to go. With maps, you have to choose. Some people find that a downside. Some people don't. Okay, so that's why I was making that saying that one of the values of the initial brain dump is that you can do it in a way that doesn't require that you have a story yet. So it's an essential neutral starting point for making links. Okay, the next step is to build a diagram. Once you've gotten your ideas out and maybe organized them some, then you start to see how you could actually create your diagram. And again, start simple and start with something that's comfortable. And an important question as you work with a diagram is, for what you're doing, is it best to think of it as a timeline or best to think of it as the kind of structure diagram that a lot of this stuff has been? If you have feedback loops, it's going to wind up being a structure diagram. If you don't have feedback loops, but just a lot of parallel tracks, then it can often work well to have as a timeline. Sometimes you want both. And there's probably some science to it, but there's also, it's a skill, it's an art to making diagrams. And I say this to say don't be too discouraged if initially you look at that blank piece of paper or you look at your pile of Post-its and you say, oh my God, how do I really make a diagram out of this? It does take practice. And the only way to get there, the only way to build those habits, you should have some chocolate after you've made your diagram. So that you get yourself some kind of reward for the work you've put in, even if you don't feel it right away. And of course, expect your diagram to grow and be refined over time, depending upon what its use is. For some things, you just sketch out a quick diagram and you go, oh yeah, geez, why didn't I think of that before? And you're done. It's enough. In other cases, you're working with other people and you're building up a new project, and your diagram becomes for all of you, kind of a home base where you gradually accumulate more and more understanding in that diagram. So the value of this second step is that not only does it externalize chunks, it externalizes the relationships. And here I want to mention there's a really wonderful, clever thing that these diagrams do, is that they turn relationships into objects as far as your subconscious is concerned. Because it's a shape. And so the visual part of your mind sees that, organizes it in space, the way our brains are so capable of doing, and now it's become an object. Even though, from your point of view, it's just expressing a relationship. So making lines for relationships is part of the human operating system magic that enables these diagrams to be so powerful. And again, it's sharing so you can do group model building. And these kinds of models with a lot of feedback loops and connections, there are a lot of aspects of the real world that fit this much better than just linear stories. If you look at an ecosystem, yeah, you can find stories in it, but the stories are not the primary way that an ecosystem flows. Ecosystems have lots and lots of feedback loops and ongoing things, and there isn't a hero and a villain and a first act and a second act and a third act. They don't flow that way. And as a diagram, as a map, if you will, it supports a lot of valid stories. Here's a map of the London Underground, or a system diagram of the London Underground, if you will. It's not a very accurate geographic map. It's kind of been abstracted. Think of all the different stations you could go between here. Each one of those is a story. This one diagram contains literally thousands of different stories. If you start adding personal journeys on this, it quickly becomes millions of stories, all supported on one diagram. So, beyond the diagramming, you get to add descriptions to give depth, just as the descriptions with that lobbyist and the congressman that we first looked at. The descriptions give a lot more depth than just the picture. And I want to recommend that if you're working in a group and you get two diverse views about what is that relationship, or what's the particular meaning of this particular piece in the diagram, have them both. You don't have to decide initially which is the right story. And there's a lot of valuable information probably in both stories. Probably both stories have some signal and some noise. And over time, as you work with the system, you may get to discover better what's there, rather than trying too soon to decide this is the right one and that's the wrong one. but only do as much description as serves. Don't feel like it's a task that you have to do. Just put in the stuff that serves. And the same applies for dynamics, which can be qualitative, as were the dynamics in the relationship ping pong, or they can be quantitative, as was in the examples of the home heating and the population. Build in appropriate sliders. You want to make sure that you aren't just describing one dynamic. The value of having a good system model is that you can experiment with lots and lots of different possibilities. This is a concrete way in which you get to find the different stories that are embedded in the model by moving those sliders around. And again, only do what serves. Only as much of the dynamics as actually helps. In your particular case, for your particular purpose. You do system modeling for your purpose, just the way a map maker makes a map for a specific purpose. Okay, so I want to tie some threads together now for actually the 3 presentations that we've done so far. So what is it that you can do to move more gracefully into the planetary era? Here's what I suggest. You're going to have your own conclusions, but here's what I suggest. First of all, learn to inhabit your optimal zone. Really develop that optimal zone hygiene, optimal zone first aid, optimal zone healing, all of those things, and get just more and more at home in your own optimal zone and more capable of helping others be able to connect with their optimal zones. Use a systems perspective, as we've been talking about tonight. And if you do both of these things, then you're in a great place to find the specific outward task that really matches for you. Somewhere in this whole innovate, implement, educate, somewhere that deals with connectivity or sustainability or diversity as an asset or self-organization, something in this whole arena. And it's not like we all need to march in the same direction. We're all drops out on that wide tarp. And we need to be covering a lot of different territories, moving them forward. If we can do that, where we have commonality in terms of this understanding and in terms of inhabiting the optimal zone and using a systems perspective, then I think we've got the commonality that we need to be able to support wonderful diversity of stories about how we innovated, implemented, and educated. So, thank you.